Order. Order. Well, good morning, colleagues. This is our first meeting of 2025. Hope you all had a good Christmas break and a Happy New Year to one and all. This morning we have before us the Electoral Commission. You are very welcome, and I'll ask you to just introduce yourselves and your roles in just a moment. But I just want to welcome 4 new faces around the committee. Let's start with our visitors first, Chris Curtis and Lee Dillon, who are guesting from the, they serve on the Select Committee for the Ministry of Communities, Housing and Local Government. As we know, it's a department which authors elections policy. Gentlemen, you're very welcome, and thank you for finding the time to take up our invitation. We are grateful. And then 2 new permanent members of the committee, John Lamont and Sam Carling. Again, you're both very welcome. Thank you for agreeing to serve, and I know colleagues and I look forward to working with both of you. Let us now just ask our guests, our formal guests, official guests as it were, to introduce themselves for the record, and then we'll turn straight to questioning.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning. I'm John Pullinger. I'm the Chair of the Electoral Commission.
Good morning, Vijay, Rangarajan. I'm Chief Executive of the Electoral Commission.
Good morning, I'm Killeen. I'm Director of Electoral Administration and Regulation for the Electoral Commission.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Our first question, John.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning to the witnesses. Your report suggests that the 2024 election was well run. Could you tell me the criteria by which you judged that?
Yes, certainly. I mean, first thing to say is that the 2024 general election was particularly challenging to run. I think I'd cite 3 reasons why it was challenging. The first is the scale of the boundary changes that took place. 584 constituencies were on different boundaries. The second was the implementation of the 2022 Elections Act, which brought in a raft of very significant changes, and I'm sure we'll come to some of those in questioning later. And the third, which you will know in particular, is the timing of the election, and particularly the impact in Scotland, where there were specific challenges because of the holiday period. And the running of an election requires the mobilisation not just of thousands of candidates and campaigners in parties and outside parties, but tens of thousands of electoral administrators, staff of the Electoral Commission and others. And the fact that it was well run, I think, is recognise the amazing hard work that all of those people put in, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to them for that work. So there are 2 criteria that we would use to say that the election is well run. The first is we ask the public. We have a large-scale survey of the public after the election, and we had 83% of people who said that it was well run, which compares well historically. And the main reasons that people who didn't say it was well run expressed concerns were about the first-past-the-post voting system, about their feeling that there was not enough information about candidates or parties, or the timing question, particularly in Scotland. So that's the first criterion, that we had a positive response from the public. It varies a little bit by different demographic groups, but across the board it's pretty high. The second criterion is based on the performance standards that we set for returning officers. So we set and monitor performance standards across the piece, and there were only 2 areas where there was a failure to meet those standards. And in those 2 areas, the concerns were about errors in the count. In neither case did the error affect the outcome of the election, and we're following up with those returning officers to kind of work through improvements that they could make. But that's a pretty good score. So on the basis of responses from the public and our assessment of performance standards of electoral administrators, we've concluded that the 2024 general election was well run.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, there's lots of participants in an election, whether it's candidates, parties, the Royal Mail, the printers, and certainly as a candidate, I certainly feel as if we get lots of oversight from the Electoral Commission, and political parties, I suspect, feel the same. Are you confident that the other participants, namely the Royal Mail and the printers and the returning officers, get the same level of scrutiny as what political candidates and political parties get?
levels of scrutiny. I mean, we have significant concerns in some areas, and I think some of the problems this time relate to supply chain issues of contractors and others not being able to deliver quickly enough, particularly postal votes. In our report, we kind of highlight the need to really look hard and to scrutinise whether those systems are resilient enough. I mean, for a long time, we have expressed concerns that the whole process is dependent on very small numbers of contractors, where there are challenges in them delivering against very short deadlines in a kind of no-fail situation, and that any one element of that falls over is really problematic. And certainly we heard and you observed that there were some problems in some areas and some near misses in several areas. So certainly as far as we see our job to provide some of that scrutiny and highlight it in our post-poll report, as we have done, but particularly in relation to printers, we think there is a significant issue that needs to be addressed.
Do you think that could have been avoided if the Commission had engaged at an earlier stage with the printers and the Royal Mail to identify, for example, in my constituency, where a Royal Mail postman was on holiday for a week, the postal ballots were not delivered because there was no replacement postman, the printers were not obviously getting the ballots into the system fast enough. If the Commission had engaged with them at an earlier stage, could those problems have been avoided?
We have been engaging, and maybe Vijay will say something about the Royal Mail because he spent particular efforts with them, and maybe Jackie say something about the printers and our discussions with the Government Department, which has a responsibility in this area. But certainly we have been expressing these concerns for some years now, and we have ourselves sought to engage. But I think your question is a well-judged one, if I may, because we need to get beyond engaging to actually making sure the system has stronger resilience and is less prone to the kinds of failures that we are really concerned about now. Okay. But would you like, Vijay, to say something about the Royal Mail at this point?
I suspect that may come up under
I think we'll deal with the Royal Mail sort of under sort of a separate in a separate section. Then we
just one more point. You mentioned under your performance criteria and the standards that you set yourself, there was an issue around account. I'm assuming that was the Putney account in Wandsworth that you were flagging.
Yes, so Wandsworth was one, Richmond was the other.
Did the Commission have staff at the Wandsworth account?
No, I don't think we did.
At what point did the returning officer notify you of the problems about the declaration of the results?
It was afterwards, which we then provided them advice with.
What sanction has been imposed on Wandsworth's returning officer?
We'll be working with them to make sure that lessons are learned. They didn't meet elements of the standards, was the conclusion of the performance standards assessment in that instance.
In terms of sanctions was my question.
I don't want us to drill into that much detail. Let me turn to Richard quickly.
A shorter question, but probably a longer answer. What do you think the reasons were that non-voters had less trust in the election, and were they the same reasons that voters had?
I think it's unsurprising. It's something we have seen. It's a consistent pattern. And I mean, you see it in other areas as well. People who have experience of the system have been through it, and they have seen for themselves that it's effective and gone away, and then said that. People who have not, one of the reasons why they may not have voted in the first place is because they have concerns that it will not be well run, and it's not for them generally. And we are seeing increasing incidence of that, and we might come to turnout later, and we have seen a dip in turnout on this occasion. So the two things are kind of bound up together. People's concerns about whether the system is going to be well run and their propensity to vote are tied up with the same set of issues in people's minds.
Is there anything particular? You mentioned first past the post, and so feel free to just go with what you think non-voters really thought were the key issues, because you can pick up lots through the media. But was there anything that came out as a key message?
Well, I think the three things that I've mentioned, because we asked people who said that they weren't satisfied, why weren't you satisfied? And the top three reasons were the system of voting, the their perception they didn't have the information they felt they needed on candidates and parties, and in Scotland in particular, the concerns about the timing of the election.
Thank you.
Can I just add, so we do some research more broadly about why people don't engage in the system, why they don't vote. And in addition to the points John's mentioned, there is a we don't trust the system. That comes through fairly loud and clear, not for a large number of voters, but it's there. We don't like politicians. We don't see why we should engage. And the biggest one of all is, I'm too busy running my own life.
Yeah.
That is the reason why most people say they don't go to the polls that particular day, is they've got something else to do. Now, it's very understandable, but there's part of it about engaging voters, and particularly young voters. So we see very sharp differences in the groups who give those answers. About half of young people aren't on the register, don't think it's important to be on the register, and don't think engaging in politics is important. And we may come back to some of the education work we think will be important later on.
We will.
Thank you.
Just at this juncture, I think it may just be helpful if I sort of, not sort of set the scene, but just make this observation. What, as a committee, are very keen to be leading the charge on, as it were, hence the is we had a general election last year. The result was so clear-cut that one or two errors, mishaps, whatever, made no difference overall to the result. We had a huge amount of changes to electoral law in the last Parliament. So I think what we're trying to do our best to establish at an early stage in this Parliament is the resilience of the administration of election law and its delivery to give robust, reliable results, irrespective of whether the overall result is a landslide for one party or another, or actually probably more importantly, when it is incredibly tight and people need to know that the result is a legitimate one. So I think quite a lot of what we want to be looking at this morning, so I just urge you to sort of couch your answers with this at the forefront of your mind, is future-proofing a system where there are clear operational changes going on, but also usage changes going on as far as how the electorate engages within the election process. Let's turn now to Lee. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Luke, did you want to come in on this question?
Yes. Sorry, it was just to add an extra point, because it's only just occurred to me from the question from John. You mentioned Wandsworth. I do recall that in 2015 I was candidate in Battersea, and it was only because I was viewing the figures before whilst they were being checked, before they were declared, that I spotted that my result had been recorded correctly. The practice at the moment seemed to be, or in 2015, was that numbers were written on a piece of paper and they were tallied up by hand. And I was particularly interested because it meant that I was going to come in fourth rather than third behind the green. And I spotted it and I pointed it out to the returning officer, and it was corrected. There does seem to be, and I'm not saying it's Wandsworth specifically, there does seem to be a lack of consistent procedures in tallying, in adding up. And I think that whilst the results being declared incorrectly is probably quite rare, or the winning result being incorrectly declared, I think there is a risk that more broadly errors are introduced into the system, and I think there does definitely need to be a better system. Is that something you have looked into, more consistent procedures within the count to tally results and to add various ward figures up, for example?
Thank you. Yes, we have been working on improving the guidance that we give to returning officers on managing the count and all aspects of the count. We've reviewed them after every election to make sure that any issues that have come up and that we've been identified in one election are taken forward into the guidance for the next. So we have tried to improve and tighten that guidance year on year. And where there is a known issue in one area, that will be factored into the degree of engagement and support we have with that administration team in the run-up to and during the next election. So we have teams working with every team of administrators across the country, and we do a sort of risk assessment based on their previous performance, what we know about what's happening in that area, any issues that have arisen in a previous election, and we work closely on those to make sure that as far as we're able to ensure those errors don't recur the next time around. Thank you.
Jackie, Killeen, you've just used the word guidance there.
Yeah.
I can provide guidance to all sorts of people. Whether they take the guidance is entirely up to them. Should there, I think this is germane to a general election, less so I think for a local, because there's differentials there. But for a general election, should there be a uniform way, in a more robust way than merely guidance? It's a national election covering the whole of the UK, that people who sit in this place know that our counts were all conducted in exactly the same way. The criteria for recounts was exactly the same. How things are tallied and recorded is exactly the same. So I suppose underlying that question is picking up from what Mr. Taylor and others have been talking about is exhortive guidance sufficient?
So I suppose the two main tools that we have are the guidance and the resources that we provide for returning officers in relation to counts, and then also the performance standards where we can judge whether the standards have been met, including in relation to counts. The guidance that we give is consistent I'm
not querying whether the guidance is not consistent. Moses issued the 10 Commandments, not the 10 guidances. And I just wonder whether... So, in essence, the question is, and I'm not talking here about the post-event review, but the conduct of the actual event itself. Mm-hmm. Should it be stronger than guidance? Should there be a rubric that all returning officers follow at a general election? And if so, who authors that? Is it you as a commission? Is it the government department through legislation? In order to have that guaranteed parity of equality.
I think the guaranteed parity of quality is certainly something we need to have. And the performance standards framework is designed to give that, which creates an objective test that we set, monitor and assess and report on. I think in terms of your question of whether we should do something about this, I think our post-poll report has highlighted the things which we need to do something about, and there's quite a list of those. This is something where we think the current system has delivered for us successfully. Now, you're right to say now is the time to look at risks that might materialise next time when there might be a lot more close results. But we had a lot of close results this time as well. We've been tested in individual constituencies in this kind of situation, and our conclusion from this time is there was not one single result that was contested, and there were only these two examples of a failure to meet our performance standards. So we do not think this is an issue that we should see as a priority for making changes to. But I think the comments that you and colleagues have made, I think reinforces the significance of our performance standards and the importance that we should be placing and do place on assessing and assuring ourselves that they are being met uniformly across the country.
And could I add, please, John, that over the course of our next corporate plan period, we will be doing more work on the performance standards to make sure that we are using them as effectively as we possibly can and drawing out all of the learning that comes out of our assessment of how they have been met at a more granular level, so that we can make sure that we are tackling any issues that might be at a lower level at this stage to prevent them becoming more significant issues down the line.
Were there to be the thou shall and thou shan't commandments, rubric of delivering account, methodology, etc., who would author it? Is it you as the Commission, or is it the government?
Well, I think under the setup we've got at the moment, there is quite widespread acceptance across the system that we are a suitable author for this guidance. Certainly within our post-poll report, we have kind of tested whether people feel that the guidance we issue is helpful and relevant
but I'm talking about it, not guidance, but an actual tick box rubric which everybody is following to give that confidence. I think many of us will say, I'd probably agree with you, Mr. Pullinger, that our electoral system has held up to pressures and challenges over these several hundred years since 1832. But casting forward, it's about resilience and robustness at a time when society becomes more questioning about the efficacy of officialdom to deliver on their behalf.
Could I just come in? I think the reason why we're not giving you a completely clear answer, it would depend exactly what we were mandating. Certainly some things we can indeed mandate, put it in the performance standards or the polling station handbook and say you need to stick to that. There is no room for discretion. We allow returning officers a large amount of discretion in general because they are the people responsible for delivering that election in the legislation, and because every constituency is very different and there is a need for quite a lot of. Now, the question I think we're touching on is how far should there be a difference?
Constituencies aren't different. Constituencies are made up of people who qualify to vote and who vote on exactly the same day or during exactly the same period. Makes no difference if you're urban, rural, northeast of Scotland or the deepest southwest of England. It's a general election. I would take the point for a local election. Mm-hmm. But for a general, I remain to be convinced.
We would say the rules are similar and we would try to enforce them overall. But for example, the activities of a returning officer running a very large, very rural constituency will be quite different from how they use their count, how they actually assemble their ballot papers from that in a much smaller, denser urban constituency. There are some areas where, and I think we're touching into the detail of electoral law here, we would like to see significant modernisation and simplification of electoral law. And that is why I think in some cases it would be government and parliament legislating who would need to make some of these changes. For example, it's very difficult for returning officers to use some of the electronic systems in polling stations because of the way that electoral law is written and hasn't been changed in those areas for 25 years. Just going to Mr. Taylor's point, we have seen significant variation in the way counts are done. Some is done on paper. Some people are using Excel spreadsheets. Some people are using electoral management software. Several of those fill me with worry, yes. Not least given the cyber threat, but not least given the possibility of error. Now, our systems are baked in, so there are many eyes on every element of this, which is good and gives a degree of resilience and testing of it. But we can do better in terms of modernising some of these systems, not least for information for candidates and for voters, but just to make sure our systems are rather more robust. And as Jackie said, that will be a theme of our coming corporate plan, is bringing some of these systems into the, at least the 20th century.
Gosh, that really is hold on to your hat sort of thing. Lee Dillon.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to bring us back to voter turnout, and in particular the turnout in the last general election, which got close to the record low turnout of 2001. Could you expand on what reasons you think for that low turnout in this general election specifically, rather than generically?
In general, turnout fluctuates, as you know. It goes very up and down. We're less concerned by the individual turnout in a particular election. But this was low. This was down at the 60% mark. It was interesting. Turnout seemed to be lower in constituencies where people were more confident of the outcome. So there is a degree of contestation driving turnout. The thing that worries us, I think, overall, though, and much more, is the long-term secular decline in turnout. Going back over 20, 30 years, we've seen turnout fall very steadily, on average, again, fluctuating by election, but falling steadily up till now. And that is coupled with a degree of, I suppose, alienation from the process of voting, from the political system, and a feeling that, why vote? That seems to come through quite strongly in the public polling. So that, rather than the specific turnout here, this is a marker. It shows it's gone down yet again. But it's that long-term secular decline over 20 or 30 years, which is a real concern for us. And I think there are things we can do. We've been running some very large campaigns. We've been trying to assure people that, for example, in the Your Vote is Yours Alone, the campaign Your Vote is Secure. We've been running work based on voter security. And clearly we want to step up the work we do on education in order to try to help on these. All these will help. We also need to work very closely with the political parties who have a massive role to play in voter turnout. But this is a shared challenge, and it's one which we will need to try to reverse.
And the Electoral Reform Society have got some research on voting systems and linked to turnout. So countries that have a PR voting system, I think, is 77% average turnout compared to 69% for a non-PR. Any views on that at all? So on the system we've got here and what that does to our turnout?
We haven't seen looking at the different electoral systems within the UK, where actually they're more comparable, we haven't seen a strong link between voting system and turnout. We have seen a link between the importance of the issues being raised and the contestations of particular seats and particular elections, where people are energised to turn out because they think their vote will count more, I think. So I'm not sure we can draw a direct link into the voting system itself from that.
Thank you.
I think if you look at sort of Scotland, Wales, where obviously there's a mixed element of election for Senate and Parliament, the turnout figures don't indicate any wildly differential between us and them and Westminster. Is there, this is not a unique phenomenon, I'd suggest, a declining number of people who are engaging in political processes in mature Western democracies. Is there a country that you would, or a sort of sister organisation that you have, that you'd look to, you know, actually that really worked to help drive turnout and reignite interest and engagement?
We've been looking and working closely with our colleagues in the Australian Electoral Commission, the Canadian and the New Zealand, very parallel, facing very similar challenges across really the entire range of challenges. And
Australia, of course, has mandatory elections.
I was going to say,
yes.
So rather than going all the way to mandating voting and registration, there are ways in which the Australians in particular have managed to reduce some of the barriers to voting. And I think those have been partly in automatic registration, and they've got a very advanced and sophisticated automatic registration system, which, if my memory serves me right, is delivering them high 90s levels of both completeness and accuracy, which is remarkable. We have seen, for example, on polling day, a spike in people wanting to register to vote on polling day. They've woken up, they've thought, oh, there's an election, I do want to vote, but I'm not registered. So being registered in advance might help those people. It's not a gigantic number, but it would help. So there's a number of different interventions one could do to help the registration system, which means people could vote. The Australians also have, and obviously just in the US elections, quite an advanced set of ways in which people can vote through early voting in different areas to make it more useful. Again, interested in exploring that. Some might work, some may not work in the UK. What tends to happen in the UK is that people use postal voting as a way of more flexible voting, and that has driven in this election an absolutely record amount of postal votes.
Yes.
We have a tremendous number, which did put the system under some strain, just the sheer number going through Royal Mail and that returning officers had to process. And it also meant that and this is returning a bit to Mr. Lamont's question, in the timetables and the calendar, elements of that were very compressed. And we are looking and have made recommendations on the calendar of postal voting in order to give a little bit more time, because we think that people will continue to use postal voting at a very significant level, which is 20% of all voters at the moment.
Mr. Dillon.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. You referenced the postal voting in America. Their postmark, as long as it's on election day, gets counted, but they have an elongated time after the election before an administration takes over. But they also have mail-only ballot boxes on the streets as well. What percentage of postal voters would we need in this country before we'd actually have to look at the whole system of how we deliver postal voting rather than relying on traditional Royal Mail delivery networks?
Well, I would say we should be looking at that now, not least because of the issues we have with the timetabling and the printer timetables interfacing with that this election, but more broadly to maintain trust in the system. People aren't, though our figures, I mean, our actual, when we ask voters, are you confident there is fraud, and did you experience any pressure in your vote at the ballot box or in postal voting? We are not seeing an increase in fraud levels or in concern about postal voting, which is good. There is a broader issue which I think is shared internationally about the way that postal systems are evolving, and they're not getting stronger. The challenges are growing. So in the end, this is something we have been discussing with our colleague electoral commissions, is how do we manage to improve postal voting and maintain that. Early voting may be part of the answer, and that was part of what I was referring to. But we're in really quite close contact with Royal Mail about how they can help. And to be honest, there's been a very good discussion with them about the changes that are happening with their new chief executive, with their excellent elections team, who did do a very good and augmented job for the general election.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lauren Edwards.
I'm quite interested. I was born in Australia, so I will declare having experience.
I'm not sure it's declarable in
I have experience of that system, which I think is a very, very good one. I know I'm a lone voice in being supportive of mandatory attendance at a polling station, not mandatory voting. You can just go along and mark. But I'm certainly have experience. I mean, sort of one of the other reasons is quite a cultural event in Australia, isn't it? So, you know, I'd hazard to suggest that barbecues at polling stations is incredibly popular and certainly works to bring people out.
I think that's called treating the electorate, isn't it?
Well, no, because it's not by it's run independently. Actually, it's run independently by charities. Actually, so it's kind of a community kind of event. There's definitely no party political, votes for sausages or anything like that. But I was going to ask about one of the things that they do in Australia that you didn't mention in terms of looking at the way that elections are administered and how changes can be made to increase turnout, and that's the day of the elections. I've always been slightly perplexed about why there's an insistence to have one in this country on a Thursday when it seems to disincentivise people who want to go to work. We obviously have lots of issues around schools being open, which limits the number of polling stations that we can have. I just wonder if you had any particular view about or any objections, I guess, to why it has never been proposed or moved to a weekend, to a Saturday, where countries like Australia do operate on that basis.
I don't think we have any objections to it. It has been, you talked about traditions in Australia. This has been a tradition in the UK for certainly as long as I can remember. I don't recall the Commission doing any significant review of this over its lifetime, and it's not been something, I don't think, that has been raised. But I think in terms of kind of Mr. Hall's description of the positioning of this inquiry, of thinking about what things might be done that would improve the voter experience and also make it more likely that the elections will be well run, thinking about the day on which the election is held is a relevant thing to think about. But while I've got the floor, and linking your question to Mr. Dillon's earlier question, we have got increasingly good experience of different approaches from Wales in particular, but I think shortly also in Scotland, of looking at alternative ways of doing the election. And we evaluated a series of pilots from experiments done in Wales that looked at voting in different early voting, having voting booths in further education colleges, for example, and a variety of things like that. So we have got some experience of testing those things, and I think there is the opportunity in our system to run pilots if there are areas willing to try things in a different way that will then help us get the experience to judge whether a more wider change might be possible.
Have you had any discussions with the government around doing a pilot approach? Would you need to engage central government or local authorities, or both?
Both, yes. But we haven't, no, for the reasons that I've said. This has not been something that's been particularly raised. I think there is the questions that you raised quite often do come up, but I think we are trying to highlight things where we know there is a specific challenge that we have experienced in the election, and those are the things we put in our post-poll report. For the 2024 election, the timing of the election in July was a problem. The fact that it was a Thursday was a much lower one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sam.
Very much. So you started to talk a little bit earlier around disengagement in young people, not just feeling that it's politics important in general. and your report says that you have a view that high-quality education about democracy and elections is important to encouraging particularly young people, but people in general, to vote. Could you go into a bit more detail about that?
Thank you. First of all, the data is showing quite clearly the disengagement. We've got it published. I won't go through all the numbers now, but essentially between 60 and 25-year-olds are, I'm say, only about half think it's important to be engaged in politics, or that it matters in their lives. Now, we do have very interesting differential data, obviously, in Wales and Scotland, which is at votes at 16. Both have had votes at 16 for some time and have been doing voter education in a different way. And we have recently convened 40 civil society organisations, a very broad spectrum around England, and have submitted some evidence to the Department for Education in their curriculum review on PSHE and how that should be done. And just to summarise briefly our views that we put into them, first of all, there is a reticence on some teachers to teach about politics because they think they're getting into party political territory and they will be, parents may be unhappy about this. We definitely think we and others like the Association of Citizenship Teachers can help with that by providing material which is neutral, certified, tested, shown to the political parties, and then help them to teach this in schools. There's something really important about showing and explaining, working with young people to show why their vote really matters for them. So what is it that, it's not a theoretical process where you go and do something strange. It is actually, it matters to your life and bring that to life rather more. And there are two linked very large issues which we think an increased focus on education right the way from about 11 through to sixth form colleges is needed. The first is mis and disinformation and digital literacy. So that is something we could bring out more as part of all this. Don't trust everything you read on social media. You're going to see some stuff that isn't true. Judge it in this way. The second, and this is where, if I may, I think you and many of your colleagues will play a central role, is in making politicians human to young people. We've got one, and again we've published this data, one very worrying graph. When we ask members of the public, is it okay to abuse someone in the street? Second question, is it okay to abuse a politician? If you're over 50 or 60, 97% of them say no, neither is acceptable. But I'm afraid when we get down to the 20s, it's still pretty unacceptable to abuse a member of the public. But about 60% of them, only 60% of them, think it's unacceptable to abuse a politician. And there's a secular change all the way down that age gradient. So this is we'll no doubt touch on the abuse and intimidation issues coming, but this is an issue which could get significantly worse. Part of that is about the information. Part of it is simply about contact with MPs, with councillors, with candidates, coming into schools and again, helping and enabling that as far as we can. And part of it is about helping young people actually vote, so go and get used to the process. One thing we are fairly sure of, and the data is pretty supportive, is voting is habit forming. If someone's voted by the time they're 16, 17, they'll continue voting. I've heard from many of the political parties, if they knock on a door and someone's over 35 and has never voted, it's not allowed. Go and spend my time elsewhere because they're unlikely to go and vote. So there is something about education, bringing candidates and politicians into schools, changing the citizenship curriculum and spending a bit more time on this, which could have real democratic and long-term benefits, I think. Sorry, that's long, but we're going to make that quite a theme of our next corporate plan.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think that statistic there around the proportion of younger people that think it's okay to abuse a politician is really shocking. And I think often in the public sort of discourse around that, you don't picture a young person as a typical person that would abuse a politician. So that's quite interesting in terms of where that's coming from. Would you say a lack of educational awareness about democracy is a problem in other age groups as well? And is there anything we can do about it?
Yes, and so I shouldn't have given the impression that we would only be focusing on young people. There are education and things we need to do with a series of groups who face particular barriers. So to give you an example, I think we've been doing quite a lot of work, but we'd like to do more on disabled voters, their access, their perception that they are not, that the access is difficult. Many of them, as we've seen, know that they can go to a polling station, but they don't realise the accessibility help that they could get in a polling station. So again, there's some more communication, information, and we're doing that primarily not through our sort of comms channels or media work, but in conjunction with the various civil society organisations with good links into disabled groups. Private sector rented accommodation, another very underrepresented group when it comes to voting. Again, there are things we can do then, and some of the work on registration may particularly help that because they tend to move quite often and not keep their registration updated. Some ethnic minority communities, again, there are the Gypsy Roma traveller community in particular, and people who are unemployed. Those are the ones who fundamentally find it harder and are underrepresented. There's no one-size-fits-all on any of this, but each takes a part of a different form of both communication, education, and then a campaign approach as we approach an election.
Thank you. One more, if I may,
yes,
Chair.
Of course.
So just to also touch on the misinformation, disinformation point that you started on with there, that's something we've had a lot of discussion around recently. Can you speak a little bit more about the actions perhaps the Electoral Commission took in advance of the election in that space?
Well, I think start with this. One thing that I did a year or so ago was convene all the other regulators that have got some experience in this space. So Ofcom, the UK Statistics Authority, the Advertising Standards Authority, the Charity Commission and a few others, to try and first of all work out who was doing what. But we also created a hub that people could come to, that the Electoral Commission ran with the support of the others, that was advice and support for voters on how to handle mis and disinformation when they came across it. So I think we've got an ongoing relationship with those groups now, and that meets very regularly and will continue to meet from here on in as the landscape evolves. And we haven't mentioned generative AI at the moment yet in this discussion, but I think over the next few months and certainly over the next few years, that has the scope to significantly transform the way in which we receive and interpret and trust or don't trust the information that comes our way. So we need to keep across it, but it's not something the Electoral Commission can do alone. In fact, we don't have any statutory powers around the content of campaign material, but others do have the opportunity to speak, and we certainly have the opportunity to convene around it. I think the core element is, as Vijay described, it's helping people be equipped to challenge information when it comes their way, so that they are sceptical about claims that don't look like they can be real. They may well not be. And we have been asking people whether they felt that they came across examples of mis and disinformation during this last election, general election campaign, and a lot of people did, but the responses were, well, we ignore it, or we didn't believe it, and generally quite encouraging responses. But we know this landscape of AI, mis and disinformation, is feeding into concerns about trust, and particularly in relation to social media. I mean, one of the stats which really impacted me when we've looked at this is we've asked people about their trust in the system and the source that they get their understanding of the news in the world from. And there was a significant association between people distrusting politics whose primary source of news was social media. And I think, again, there are issues there we need to think very carefully about. I think as the implementation of the Online Safety Act goes forward, I think there's going to be a lot of experience in Ofcom about that, and we're certainly working very closely with them to monitor what's happening. And also work with organisations like the Alan Turing Institute, who did a very nice review of the impact of mis and disinformation on the election, and it was generally reassuring this time. But looking forward, we should be much more concerned. And again, back to the Chair's statement at the beginning, that we now need to be thinking what we need to address between now and the next general election. This is certainly one of them, because it has the scope to undermine people's confidence in the system, and I think that's the key criterion we should be judging ourselves by.
Thank you. Andrew, what speed are you putting on this? Because if stuff requires information, you know how slowly the legislative machine grinds in this place. And the general election, let's presume it will be May 2029, is not actually that far away. And is this sort of a piece of work that gets, with recommendations, completed within, let's say, for example, the next 6 months?
The first thing to say is I think recommendations in this space are really difficult, and the discussions that took place in the last Parliament around the Online Safety Act demonstrate how difficult they are. I mean, the key thing we need for a democracy to be and remain healthy is freedom of speech. And the ability of people to have opinions and people to be respectful of opinions which are not their own. However vehemently put, we must have respect for that. So navigating the boundary between something which is trying to prohibit something which is deemed to be unacceptable, whilst at the same time respecting freedom of speech, is a really difficult one, and one that will require significant parliamentary debate. So your question is it needs to be done at pace, but it also needs to be done thoughtfully if we're not to have unintended consequences. But Parliament is debating this, because it's not just about elections, it's about all kinds of aspects of our public life, and people's trust in all kinds of issues. I mean, vaccinations would be the most obvious analogy you might draw here. How do you navigate successfully the maintenance of freedom of speech, which is against the corrosion of a system which we all need to uphold, is going to be one that is very careful. And countries that have tried to step into this space in the elections arena have had some difficulties. I mean, Australia is an example that has attempted this. Ireland would be another one where they have been looking into this. So we are looking at experiences of other legislators, and we are trying to bring that into our own evidence. But we are certainly looking at this at pace, because it is changing at pace, and if we need to do something before the next election, it will need to be done sooner rather than later.
I'm conscious of time, and I've got a long call list of people who want to take part in our proceedings. So I'm going to ask John wanted to come in on this area, and then I'm going to turn to Marcus, and then we will go and have a canter around the issue of postal voting.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, my question is about where people get information from about the activities of MPs, less so about election time, but it does come up at election time. So there's a website called theyworkforyou.com, and it purports to tell you, I've spoken to you about this before, Vijay, it purports to tell voters how MPs have voted on different issues. So I'm sure if you go into my profile, it says I voted to pump sewage into the water, it tells me I voted to take free school meals away, and various other things. But I had a very abusive constituent on the doorstep during an election campaign who was adamant I'd voted against same-sex marriage, despite the fact as an MSP, along with Richard in the Scottish Parliament, I'd voted and spoken in favour of same-sex marriage when it was being debated. But because of some obscure amendment to some Northern Irish legislation, they had said that I was against same-sex marriage, which caused my constituent rightly a lot of anger. I just wonder what control you can exercise over websites like that. It's more of an issue, I have to say, for government MPs as for opposition, because as a government you have to defend government business and often take difficult decisions, as I have discovered over the last few years. But there needs to be some control over the types of information that voters are being given, and allowing them to inform themselves more accurately than what they are just now, particularly for that website. I mean, I've raised it directly with that website, and they're refusing to budge in terms of how they report my voting record, despite the fact I was able to provide them clear evidence of how I'd voted in the Scottish Parliament on that particular issue. But there's other examples, and I'm sure other MPs have experienced different or similar experiences with voters as a consequence of information on that website.
I mean, I think that particular example, it would be very difficult for the Electoral Commission to have an influence in that, because of our remit being tightly around elections. But I did spend 10 years being responsible for the parliamentary website back in the day, and They Work For You was setting itself up then. And I think there is certainly a role for the parliamentary website to make sure there is a clarity of a statement of record and an ability for people to interrogate it very effectively. And I think the parliamentary website has come on leaps and bounds in my time, but in the original conception of They Work For You, they were filling a void, and they were filling it with well, they were a group of enthusiasts who were creating something, but they were meeting a demand from people to have accurate information. So I think the key, if there is a concern, which you clearly have, and I know it's reflected in other members as well, that what they are doing is not fulfilling a public service by giving accurate information about what MPs are saying.
It's the opposite.
I think the key is to make sure there is a source where people can go to that.
It's contextualisation.
Yes.
Marcus Campbell-Severs.
I was just going to jump, because Vijay touched on it before. In the Elections Act, it introduced the new accessibility requirements. I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how that's worked in practice. I know that there is, correct me if I'm wrong, but the impression I got was that these actually caused some challenges for some of our councils in terms of identifying suitably accessible polling stations, and that may have led to some reduction in the number of polling stations, consolidation of polling stations being located in locations that might not be as accessible for some people. And you mentioned as well that perception of what is available to people, and actually in some cases is just not having a polling station close to you the most important thing for people with accessibility issues.
Shall I start, or do you want to?
Should I just give a little bit of the picture of so we've been pushing on accessibility for quite a while. You're absolutely right, that does sometimes mean changes to where polling stations are, or making sure they're actually accessible for anyone with, say, a mobility need. 96% of disabled voters said it was easy to get inside a polling station and vote. So that is already, we're quite pleased, that's quite a good statistic. However, only 49% of disabled voters knew, and just check the exact wording, agreed the information, equipment and support was available to them. So we do think there is more that needs to be done for the support for disabled voters to go. There were only, across the whole of the general election, 117 requests for specific equipment. And that was a remarkably small number. You can ask in a polling station that someone will help you with whatever your disability is, but 117 requests, I think we interpret that as meaning people didn't realise they could ask and that it was their right to ask. Administrators mostly found our guidance useful on that, but we're continually talking to them about what more could be done. And the assistive technologies are changing all the time, so that's helping a lot. So overall, not a bad picture at the moment, but there is more we can do to help both administrators and I think voters with any form of disability to be able to vote safely and securely. One of the complaints that we heard at this election was people going and being helped by, say, a presiding officer to vote, but then not feeling that their vote was secret. That there are ways of, particularly for blind voters, to use assistive technology, which will help that, and would like to see that. I think more broadly rolled out. And just final point, there is a tension between having a polling station very close to you and that polling station being accessible. And that's one that I think returning officers have to navigate very carefully. You can put it as I think one is in the front room of a pub, but it's not very easy to get into. And some people may be put off having it there. So there's a real balance about where
you mentioned some
these
of the stats from before. What were some of the stats on how many people felt that accessing the polling station was achievable? What was it before? I mean, prior to these changes coming in, was there a big issue there that this was designed to deal with? Yeah,
there was an issue about the perceptions by disabled voters in the last sort of decades have been that they first of all, it was difficult to get in to vote. Second, that there was very little help for them. We've tried to set that out. And third, there was still a lingering perception, interestingly, among voters with mental disabilities, that the old rules on peers and madmen not being able to vote somehow left a sort of social tinge, and that they weren't welcome voters. So we've been working with MenCap in particular, but several other Mind and several other charities, to get the message across that they are indeed utterly legitimate voters who should be there and vote, and returning officers have an obligation to help them vote. Because there's a number of different groups to work with. I don't know, Jackie, you want to talk more about the experience of administrators? And
well, I was just going to highlight first, if I may, Jackie, that a key recommendation in our report is more needs to be done for disabled voters. They continue to face challenges, but the Elections Act 2022 did make significant improvements, and I think some of the issues with polling stations, there are two things happening together. returning officers are finding it much more difficult to find polling stations. And not just polling stations that are accessible, and that's becoming more and more challenging, and that's something we get reported back to us. But the improvements for disabled voters this time were twofold, and I think quite important and appreciated. The first is making it much clearer who can be a companion to a person who needs to have someone to assist them when they're going into a polling station to vote, and I think that has been taken up and well supported by many. But the second thing is just making it much clearer what sorts of support people can expect in the polling station. Blind and partially sighted voters, I think, are a particular group who face challenges because of the nature of having to complete the ballot paper. And the responses we've had from the RNIB, the Thomas Pocklington Trust and other organisations that work with blind and partially sighted people have been encouraging. So progress but more to do is, I think, where we would put this. But blind and partially sighted voters and people with learning difficulties particularly are the ones where we would focus. But generally, I mean, our guidance for polling stations, I will let Jackie come in a minute, is about making sure the basics are there: ramps, doors, ability to get in the building, and helpfulness of staff. I mean, this is the basics that people need to be able to cast their vote in comfort and in secret. But Jackie, do you want to add?
Mr. Bullen, you said, sort of en passant, that returning officers are finding it harder to find polling stations. Why?
Oh, Jackie, do you want to come in with this?
I suppose they have to balance a set of considerations: availability, familiarity, and then accessibility. So the ability of those potential polling station venues to meet all of those needs. And then, if you think about the timing of an election, as well as that, it's an additional factor to consider. So it just adds to the set of issues that administrators have to weigh up when they're planning how they're going to deliver an election, and in particular around polling stations. I was going to, if I may, I was just going to add to what John and Vijay have said. So based on our experience from the May and July elections, when we've seen the new accessibility measures be implemented for the first time, we do think that there are probably more things that can be done. So I think we would probably want to emphasise that more both offline and online information should be available to disabled voters, voters with accessibility needs. One of the things that we think could be helpful would be to include this on polling cards, for example, so that people who may not be online are able to request in advance what accessibility measures, and that might reduce one of the barriers that prevents people from going in the first place. And the other thing that we will be doing is looking at whether our voter information tool can be enhanced to provide better information around accessibility as well as location of polling stations. And we will continue to look at how our own guidance to returning officers and administrators can be improved on this.
Thank you. Richard Baker, very quickly.
Very quickly, to declare an interest, I used to work for the learning disability charity Enable, who worked with the Commission to provide information to people with disabilities, particularly around requirements for voter ID. But you mentioned, Vijay, the work of the RNIB in this area and their turned out report, which found that 73% of all respondents didn't know they could request reasonable adjustments. So, building your point, Jackie, isn't it vital to get more information out to those people and in the appropriate accessible formats, not just for blind and partially sighted people, but for all those people who require alternative communication formats?
I mean, our primary recommendation is increased awareness and to work through other organisations, but also returning officers, and through our own work to really double down on getting the message out there.
Right, let's turn to postal voting. Let's start with the first question. Or establish a principle, I suppose. Is the postal voting genie now out of the bottle? It used to be a quite rarefied commodity with very tightly drawn reasons for requiring one. People now have a standing postal vote. Given the drive for accessibility, potential changes in the electorate, in the franchise. Give us your thoughts on the operation and resilience of the postal voting system, which is coming under increasing demand, has greater regulatory complexity, and a principal deliverer, i.e. the Royal Mail, which is now obviously coming under new ownership, is generally dealing with a lower volume of daily envelopes and so on and so forth, and therefore workforce patterns are changing. So the Royal Mail's resilience to deliver in a meaningful way. And allied to that, speaking back to the point about uniformity, a general election. We now have general election days, and the vagaries of the timing of when postal votes are issued and how. Because that can affect outcomes dependent upon what the dominant issue, scandal, policy announcement, whatever, may have been. So something upon the timing and something about the sort of future resilience for a service which seems to have an increasing demand and a more challenging environment to deliver. I don't necessarily mean physically.
Do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. Thank you. We absolutely recognise your description, and in terms of is the genie out of the bottle, the data would indicate that yes it is. So over the last couple of elections, we've seen a growing trend towards postal voting. 20% of the electorate registered for a postal vote at this election. That's up from 18% in 2019. I think this is also the first UK general election at which people could apply online for a postal vote, and 1.3 million people did that after the election was called, which in turn put a huge additional strain on administrators. So ease of facility for voters who would then expect the whole experience to be equally smooth, but the sort of plumbing behind that online front door is not quite the same as that first experience. So while I think 89% of postal voters said that they were satisfied with the process, I think you will all be aware that there were definitely some issues this time around, and a number of people didn't receive their postal votes in time to complete and return them before polling day. On this election, I would probably just add that there were some.
Just pausing there, is your hunch that may have been disproportionately affected as an issue of importance because it was sort of holiday time, particularly popular for people without kids, who may be going away before the great onslaught of buckets and spades at beaches, etc. And therefore, is it a distorted figure or is it part of a trend?
We would say that it's part of a trend, but it was, we think probably that trend was assisted in this election, particularly in Scotland and probably also in Northern Ireland by the timing of the election, where the schools had would already have broken up by the time the election took place in many local authority areas. So the increase of postal vote applications in those areas would have been higher. It's impossible to say that with absolute complete certainty that would indicate that we became aware of higher applications from Scotland and Northern Ireland, but they have a different way of applying in Northern Ireland, so not quite the
Jackie,
not quite the same.
You mentioned Scotland there. Was the problem made? I'm trying to get a handle whether the data is sort of reliable or whether they're sort of freak things which sort of distorted. But my understanding is that as far as the print contract was concerned, as far as Scotland was concerned, the person who let the contract to the printers didn't tick the priority print box. So the Scottish ballot papers were just sort of the next job off the taxi rank, rather than triaged because there was a set of prescribed dates. That added to the problem in Scotland, but not then because of school holidays and everything else.
Yeah, so I think possibly a couple of things to say on that. One is that people probably don't understand the mechanics of what happens when you apply for a postal vote, that they're not printed on demand, that printers print in batches, and in this instance, the printers printed in two batches. So people who applied early after the election were called and whose postal votes went out in that first batch would have been far more likely to receive their votes in time. People who applied for a postal vote later and whose postal ballot was included in the second batch were more likely to not have received their vote in time. In Scotland, there were absolutely issues with the print contract or the fulfilment of some of those print contracts, particularly a production issue quite late in the day, where we did then see administrators and indeed others pull out all the stops to try and make sure that votes did get printed and fulfilled and returned and delivered in time, and arrangements made by a number of local authorities to allow people to return their postal votes in particular areas. But it did highlight the fragility, I think, that we've mentioned earlier in the supply chain and the supply market for postal votes in particular, that behind the front door experience. And I think, if I may, when we reflected on that, a couple of improvements that we think, one is around improving the information given to voters, both before and after they apply for a postal vote. So when they apply online, it's the sort of what to do next, so that they can understand if actually this method of voting is going to work for them, and whether perhaps an alternative method such as proxy voting might have been more suitable in this. I think we would also recommend, and have done, looking at the rules for reissuing postal votes. At the moment, they can only be done like 4 days before polling day. That doesn't give much flexibility to administrators to step in and help when something has gone wrong like that. And I think we've also been recommending looking at the funding available to just make this system more robust overall, so that administrators can deliver the system that voters expect to experience when they apply for a postal vote.
Given that the uncertainty of timing of a general election has returned since the abolition of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, have you issued guidance to returning officers when letting contracts to print the packs that they should ensure that they have a priority claim on the printer's work dockets?
So the relationship with the printers is sits more with government, but we have been reviewing how we can focus administrators' attention on the issues and challenges, and how they make sure that they address those in a timely manner. So we've reviewed a lot of our guidance, as you would imagine, post-poll, working on the polling station handbook at the moment for the next election, and other pieces of guidance. So yeah, absolutely looking at how that can be strengthened insofar as it's within our locus to do that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Vijay.
That's just
yes,
one minor thing. One thing that did confuse voters was not being able to hand in a postal vote into a council office or direct to a returning officer.
Yes. And
having to either put it into a Royal Mail post box or take it into a polling station. So we may, I think, very much want to look at it to say, if you can hand it in, and we'll obviously need to think carefully about the numbers and potential for any fraud and so on, but it could be easier to be able to hand in postal votes. And that was a change which was maybe we want to review.
Could I add, sorry, Chair,
yes.
one last thing, which is in terms of your point on future-proofing. So I think we would say that the trend is likely to continue, and if we also then see an extension of the franchise so that more, for example, younger people are included, then we do need to invest in this and address the issues in this system overall, so that it is fit for purpose in the future. And that is also in the context of what Vijay referred to, I think, as sort of declining postal systems globally, and that leads probably into some of the overseas voting issues, which you may come on to separately.
That review, when, by whom and how?
I think that's probably a number of us together, but that is, we absolutely want to contribute to that, but it's probably for government as well as the suppliers and administrators too.
And we are discussing that with government already as to how we get that going with some urgency so that the improvements are in place by the next general election.
Thank you, Chair. Given the situation in Scotland which affected, John's constituency said earlier, and people in my constituency on polling day did not have their postal vote, I think the Chair's question is really very important. And you said that there was responsibility in government in Scotland to ensure the contract was prioritised, to ensure that that supply was there in terms of printers and supplies, so that the materials could be sent out, the votes could be sent out. What discussion has been taking place to ensure that decision isn't repeated in future, the appropriate priority is given, and people can rightfully expect that within those parameters they should be able to receive their postal votes in time, and yes, hand them back in if councils make that facility available, which not all councils did, but obviously preferably send them in by the normal process. We've discussed this with the Electoral Management Board in Scotland, who is has a locus in working with administration teams in Scotland as well. So I think review of the contractual arrangements, the resilience of those contracts, and making sure that they're fit for purpose for the next Scottish elections as well as the next general election is top of everybody's agenda on this, just to reassure you.
Okay, thank you. And the Royal Mail and resilience. And can I just link to that, is that we have a tendency, don't we, of having a sort of sedimentary approach to these things. We've voted this way since whenever, and we just, something else changes. I think I know Vijay's answer to the question, which is we sort of slightly retrofit and keep our fingers crossed that the system will somehow or another rise to a new challenge and somehow or another deliver. Everybody will be knackered at the end, but they will have delivered it. There is an argument, isn't there, that effectively says let's have a fundamental scrapping of everything that we've got at the moment and start from scratch to find a robust election system fit for the next 60, 70 years. What happens when Royal Mail says we can't deliver all these pieces of paper?
I don't think we would say we need to scrap everything, but we do say the whole canon of law and guidance and everything that sits underneath it has become so unwieldy that it's almost impossible to administer or follow with your own administrator or a candidate or campaigner or party. And that inevitably then leads to confusion to voters too. And that feels to us unsustainable. And I mean, the last government very helpfully commissioned the Law Commissions of England, Wales and of Scotland to have a thorough review as to how electoral law could be consolidated. They have produced a report which has been supported in general by all the political parties, and we believe that is a really critical piece of work that needs to be taken forward with some urgency, because at the moment we have been stretching and stretching and stretching the system and adding more and more complexity to it, and there will come a point where it does fail if it's not addressed, and we see those risks growing, and we look at risks to the system and we see kind of acute risks, which are those that are upon us on election day, but chronic risks which build up, and the risk of the canon of law being something which is itself problematic is a chronic risk which has been growing very substantially, and we've said some positive things about the Elections Act in this meeting, but the extension in terms of the quantity of law has been a challenge for all of us to get our heads around. And my tribute at the beginning to the staff involved in that, this was a huge piece of work just to understand the law we were now expected to implement. So we believe that there is a starting point in the work that the law commissions have done. There is a process within Parliament for taking through legislation that does consolidate the law, and we are certainly working very, very hard within the Commission, and indeed I convened a panel of some of the leading lawyers, particularly those that represent parties and are involved in adjudicating cases that come to court about elections matters, and there was unanimous support for this as being something that could, should and can be done, and we will certainly, or are already taking that to the incoming government in Westminster, saying, look, we need to get on with this, because it will not be a straightforward thing to do, but we believe it's an area where there is likely to be cross-party support, because all parties have already given it their support. So the question is where it fits in the timetabling of legislation within government, and how confident we can be that it will be taken through without turning itself into a kind of enormous activity that takes up more time than people are prepared to spend on it. But certainly we 100% agree with you. This is something that needs to be dealt with, yes. And the sooner it's dealt with, the sooner we mitigate the growing risks that we already see arising.
What is your assessment of fraud and postal voting?
I've got a data if you want.
So, when we have asked the public about fraud in relation to postal voting and in-person voting, the answers aren't so very different. There is a small proportion of people that indicate there are concerns about being coerced into voting in a particular way, which I think is a particular concern in relation to polling stations, which comes up in reports from observers, but also in relation to postal voting, where you don't know what is going on inside a household. So we see, and certainly we hear significant reports, certainly from some areas of the country, that there is this concern. Our response at the moment, and for several years now, has been to run a campaign with Crime Stoppers that is titled "Your Vote is Yours Alone," and to get across to particularly those communities where we think this is most likely to be a concern, the message that people have the right to vote, make their own minds up about what they're voting, and be able to vote in secret, whether postal or online. We think that the systems put in place for both postal voting and for in-person voting have improved the secrecy of the ballot, and Vijay's already quoted statistics that from this general election there is a high level of confidence that the system is protected from fraud. But we continue to hear the concerns, and we see there are concerns, and we think we should keep on putting out the message that voting is something which is for the individual, and for them to have the opportunity to do it in secret. We are not proposing here new or enhanced measures, but we are continually vigilant to those that we see. Now, we are currently...
the existence of sort of pop-up in some communities of election centres where the community is encouraged to all come together with their ballot papers, postal ballot papers, and have it as a sort of effectively a community event. Now, that's not necessarily fraud, but it can lead to coercion, and it can also lead to women in particular, and young women specifically, feeling very constrained with regards to the freedoms by which they can cast their ballot. Mm.
Well, I mean, coercion, I mean, I used the word coercion in my response to you earlier, and I think we would certainly bracket that within the issue of fraud, and that is the question we're concerned about here. Our response is, as I've said, to really double down on getting the message across to those communities, and that your voting, these are the places you can go for help and assistance, and that coercion and fraud is a crime, and we work very closely with the police to get that across. But it continues to be the case. There are very small numbers of cases that actually come to court and are prosecuted on this. So the primary response we think that we can reasonably make is the public awareness response here. Whether Vijay or Jackie want to come in, but it's
where public awareness and cultural norms, let me use that word, cultural norms collide.
Yes.
And where public information comes off as the loser.
Chair, just say we are in the process of collating all the UK fraud data from the general election. We aim to publish that in March or April. So we're working with the police, and we've been obviously keeping a close eye on any of the actual cases the police are investigating, but also looking at the perceptions of voters as to whether there is a difference between their perception of secrecy and coercion in a ballot paper, in a polling booth, or in postal voting. We don't see at the moment, but this is at quite a high level. We don't see overall a difference. About 80% of people in both postal voting and in the polling stations think their vote is secret. They give them a sliding scale of 1 to 5. That's a 4 or a 5. We're also not seeing differences when people say, there is elements of coercion. It's very small, but we're not seeing a lot. But that could mask the issue that you're saying, which is it's very localised in some areas. I mean, in some ways, we would applaud groups who get together, a group of people, and say, come on, let's all fill out a postal vote, as long as they were not pressuring people to vote a particular way. And so that's the issue which we were looking at. We were looking
that's contrary to the 1872 Secrecy of the Ballot Act.
It's very important that people are able to enter a secret ballot, particularly with the postal vote. We agree. But if people saying, let's all fill out our ballot paper, it's time, get together, fine, and it could be a good way of encouraging people to actually fill out their ballot papers. What we have seen is a very small number of actual cases of the police. Now, this is incomplete data. At the moment, around 160 cases, but most of those seem to be on imprints, a couple of bits of candidate financing and spending, and a couple of areas of, false statements were coming through. So these are being investigated at the moment. Quite a lot are being resolved. The number of cases of things like personation, for example, are 0 to very small digits, but that's an extremely small number. So we will publish all this in March or April.
Mr. Dillon.
The questions were on Crime Stopper numbers versus what we think the actual number of issues are out there, so I'll wait for the reports. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
And just on the police, I think there was a more robust approach to policing, wasn't there? A greater drive towards uniformity of the police's role as helping to deliver the election.
Yes. So
this time, is that a trend that you see continuing and hope to improve?
Chair, you're absolutely right. Before the election, we produced some joint guidance with the National Police Chiefs Council, particularly to help police officers, for whom obviously this is not necessarily their day-to-day issue, but help them interpret electoral law, which is complex in this area. We think we're going to have to do a significant amount more on that, particularly, but I think we will discuss this in the Speakers' Conference on abuse and intimidation, because that is where some of these issues will come up. The police put a significant amount more resource into it, as did Operation Bridger, as did many other parts. Yes. And there's great gratitude to them and to Home Office colleagues in particular for work on this. But given the threats that we have seen, it's definitely an area we're going to have to do more on.
Thank you. Charlotte, and then I've got Charlotte and then Richard Baker. Charlotte Kane.
Is this on overseas voting now?
No, I've got you down for postal as well. Yeah, you're having two back, but let's deal with postal at the moment, and then we will come on to overseas.
Yeah, so you've touched on this actually in several answers and in your opening remarks, the timing of the election, and that clearly had a significant impact in your view on the postal voting. So have you considered what the implications would be of either going to fixed-term elections, how that might help, or having restricted periods, such as holiday periods, when elections wouldn't happen?
Well, I mean, Parliament's recently debated the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and I think the key things that we have made recommendations on is to give enough time for the elections to be run in an orderly way. And I think in relation to this particular occasion, because July elections are very, very unusual, we have been very clear in our report in saying that the fact that it was scheduled for July was problematic, and that particular account should be taken of people who are likely to be away on holidays, and to recognise the situation is different in different parts of the UK. I mean, in this case, particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland. But I don't think we would want, or I don't see a need to make recommendations beyond that. I mean, the timing of the election under the procedures we've got at the moment is for the Prime Minister to take a view on, and we are just spelling out, which I think is the limit of what we can do, the consequences of doing it at a different time, and for the Prime Minister to be accountable for the decision that is made as a result. So I think we're clear July didn't work well, and we think it would be problematic to do that again. But beyond that, I don't think we would make a recommendation. I'm looking at you. I don't think we would we?
That hasn't been where our focus has been. On a sort of smaller scale, one of the things that we have recommended is looking at the election timetable, so the period from between when an election is called and polling day, to see whether that can be amended to enable administrators to have more time to issue to maybe perhaps have an earlier deadline for postal voting applications, so that they are able to process them and issue them in a more timely fashion. It's a very compacted timetable, the election timetable. It's a lot of work for administrators to get through, and we can see the sort of cumulative impact of that. So one of the things we have suggested to government, and we're talking to them about that, is looking at the actual election timetable rather than the sort of bigger scale issue that you're talking about.
There's a balance there, isn't there, between the electorate becoming fully aware of exactly when the election will be and what the impact of that is on their other plans, and therefore having time to apply for postal and proxy votes, and making it easier for the administrators, unless you're talking about actually bringing the whole election timetable, making it longer.
We didn't see a lot of evidence of support for that, so we were more focusing on what seemed more likely, which was to see whether there is any potential flexibility within the existing timetable as it stands. So when those deadlines fall within the election timetable, but as you say, our main. That would sit alongside one of our main recommendations, which is about the information provided to voters as well, so that they can understand whether these different absent voting options are going to work for them in their circumstances, which we think has to be improved and increased for the next time. That's a key piece of learning from this election.
And the debate on the Fixed Term Parliaments Bill shows the tensions in both directions. So the sweet spot is a very small place to be, and as Jackie says, we're trying to navigate within that sweet spot rather than drive a fundamental reform, which I think would be very challenging to give effect to.
The Fixed Term Parliament Act was let's not forget, it was only introduced to provide stability to a unique peacetime coalition, not to ease the delivery of electoral administration.
Sure, but the debate was a really instructive one in terms of the tensions as to whether you should have more time or less time. I think that's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Do you think that the old working presumption was that the administrators, in all its general sense of the term, needed 5 weeks from the dissolution of Parliament to election day as a minimum? Mm-hmm. Is that still the same, do we think, or is it now up to 6?
Well, I think, from an administration point of view, the longer you've got, the better, particularly when it's unexpected and from a standing start. But from a campaign point of view, then there are pressures in the other way. So that's why I describe it in terms of a sweet spot.
Okay. time. Mr. Baker and then Mr. Driven. Mr. Baker.
Thank you. And Jackie's spoken about, reforming the timetable of elections, and your report on election makes a number of proposals around making rules for reissuing postal votes more flexible, and other forms of early voting have been discussed today. How optimistic are you that these reforms could be brought in ahead of the next UK general election, presuming that is in 4 or 5 years, and how are these proposals being received by those who have got the authority to bring them forward into effect change?
I mean, we are having positive discussions with the government. It certainly does depend on the government to do some of these things, but I mean, we've identified the issues, we've identified the risks of not dealing with them, and so far so good in terms of having positive discussions.
You think there's good evidence that these changes will make the system more robust and effective in the future?
Well, I think for some of the changes we're talking about, I've already highlighted implementation of changes in Wales and our evaluation of pilots in Wales, and I think they've been encouraging responses to some of the reforms that have taken place there, and our evaluations show they can be successful, and I think we will be running some pilots, I think, in Scotland over or evaluating some pilots in Scotland over the year or so ahead, and I think that's a chance for us to get increasing confidence that this can be done. But we do need to get on with it, as the Chair has suggested, that it feels like a long time till the next general election, but given the sequencing of processes and the need to get them in place well before so that people can administer them successfully, means the time is actually quite short.
Chair, if I could just add, yes. We have major elections in 2026, so actually we're trying to take some of the learning of this into those elections as well, not just wait. That will be part of the timetabling issue, the way postal votes are done, and we're obviously been working extensively with the Welsh and Scottish governments on the conduct orders for those, and trying to improve those as well, just to make these changes in advance. And there'll be another set of learning out of the 26 elections that we'll also need to use in 28, 29, whenever the general is.
And will that continue to reflect on the evolutionary potential of digital and IT?
Absolutely.
Very much. If I may say, you raised, Chair, and John responded with the set of legal issues that would help to avoid the sedimentary problem you alluded to. There's some fundamental data and IT issues that we would also like to look at quite closely. So first of all, on the register itself. The register in many ways is quite an old-fashioned thing. Changing that, making it more robust, making it more resilient to cyber attack and many other things would enable many of the changes that I think we're all discussing here. It's a limiting factor in many cases for what we can then do. Voter information, as I think Jackie's already mentioned, we can increase the amount of digital and offline voter information. It's curious, we don't have a list of elections. We don't actually have the government nor the Electoral Commission maintain the list of polling stations and accessibility. So I'd like to do that and do that properly so that voters have access to what polling stations, what elections, what candidates there are, and so on. So there are some really quite fundamental things. We can modernise the system without changing major elements, but that will enable some of the other changes that we then want. So the register, the underlying data, and I think some of the electoral management system issues as well. We have a patchwork of different electoral management systems, and I think it comes back to the point on uniformity that you were mentioning, Chair. They're not very uniform, and the way that things are run are just not uniform between them, and we'd like to see them raised to a higher bar.
Thank you. Let's turn to overseas voting, and let's turn to Charlotte Kane. Charlotte.
Thank you, Chair. I think the first thing before we discuss the detail of overseas voting is how robust is the data that you've got? Because my understanding is that most local authorities haven't published details on the percentage of overseas voters and the national split, the split of the countries that they're voting from. Is that correct?
Jackie wants to correct me. I think it's correct, yes. We don't have the complete data as to the split of overseas voters yet published by constituency. What we do have is a smallish survey of a group of overseas voters as to how their experience was, and obviously the numbers from the various portals about what the application rates were and the registration rates were. That's the data we do have.
So what are you doing to try and get a fuller picture?
Partly talking to overseas voters themselves. I mean, we do think from what we've seen so far that many of them found it incredibly difficult to vote at this general election. So they are a group of people, obviously relatively newly enfranchised by Parliament, who many found it incredibly difficult to get a vote back. There were reasons for that. Partly the international mailing times didn't help. But it wasn't just that. I mean, there's some very interesting distinctions between different countries. So we think that the numbers that we've got at the moment, about 170,000 applications to register, only of the new citizens abroad, only about somewhere around 26% were aware of those changes. So there's a large number who simply aren't aware that they are eligible to vote. The return rates varied enormously by country. So we think, for example, voters in France, 75% of them were able to return their ballot on time, but voters in Spain, 32% were able, which seems an incredible disparity. Clearly, distance did play a part. Only 6% of UK voters in Australia were able to return their ballot on time. But that just means that a lot of people enfranchised who were not able to vote. So it was partly a function of the printing times and people registering, and partly a function of the sheer time it took to send and then return a ballot paper. So it's one area that we do think we need to look at quite extensively, possibly quite fundamentally in terms of the changes. How should people vote? Should they be able to use, for example, sending out a ballot paper electronically and then returning it on paper? There are some issues about that, and that it would be possible to then tell, because they'd have printed it out, that it was a different ballot paper. Should we be able to use our network of consulates and embassies to enable that? We've begun that discussion with FCDO about what is possible and how that could be done. And then should be using, for example, things like telephone voting. This is another Australian good example of they use it, and I saw it at work in Australian Capital Territories and more broadly. But it's quite secure, and there are ways in which we could actually enable that. So it's an area we'd like to propose some pilots to experiment, to discuss what is possible, because fundamentally we don't think the experience of overseas voters really was a good one at this election.
It's ironic, given that what you were saying earlier about high turnout in Australia for their elections, that there was such a small proportion of our voters living in Australia who managed to get their postal votes back in time. So you sound reasonably hopeful that you might be able to set up, well, not you, that we might be able to set up a structure that would allow overseas voters to use our consulates and embassies to ensure that their vote gets through in time.
I think we're at the early stages of discussion at the moment, and there's a number of issues. For example, the security of the ballot. How do you handle people who are outside, say, where an embassy or consulate, are they sending it to them? So there's a lot of real operational detail on safety and security and privacy of the ballot that we'll need to work through. But this is an area where we'll need to work incredibly closely with government, with MHCLG, with FCDO and others.
Would there need to be legislative change to facilitate that, enable that to happen?
It almost certainly will require some legislative change to allow that to happen, and a significant series of guidance changes to allow people, I mean, for example, who is the returning officer, where is the ballot sent back to? We'd be in the situation where people would be able to be registered in different constituencies in the UK. How would we manage to get the correct ballot paper to them abroad, and for them to be able to get it back to the right returning officer in time? One thing which is very different in the UK general election from either the Australian or the US approaches is that they have a significant period after the election when ballots can return, up to 30 days in many cases. We obviously want a definitive result, and Parliament particularly wants a definitive result to know which MPs are elected within a couple of days of the general election. So our time frame is much tighter than for other countries, and that's one of the things we will need to test, what is actually even logistically possible.
Well, one of the other recommendations you had was to make sure people are more aware of the ability to use proxy voters, so some issues that arise from that, not just in fact for overseas voters but for UK ones as well, is the proxy voter obviously has to be someone you trust and someone with some connection to you, so they may not be physically in the constituency in which you're voting, and they in turn can then get a postal vote. So it's how we make that clear to people, because as I find with UK voters as well, there's a lack of clarity, and and whether there would be any scope for something like, if you're a shareholder in a business, you can give your proxy vote to a trusted officer of the business. It doesn't have to be someone you know. Have you considered anything like that?
I don't think there's a limitation that we put on who you can make a proxy voter. I mean, you can choose someone to be a proxy voter. The issue we did hear from a number of overseas voters was they didn't have somebody they trusted sufficiently in the UK to make a proxy voter, and it's by definition not a secret ballot. Someone else knows the way you voted. So there's a reticence to do so as well. So this is one area where we will try to give as similar an experience as to UK voters. It may not be exactly the same, but at the moment they have a very different experience.
And so do you have plans in place for communicating with overseas voters to make them aware of all the current options at least?
Yes, we will need to run, and we're thinking of this in terms of the campaigns we're going to run before the next. Obviously, the general election is the crucial one. How we'll communicate out. That was why the figure, only about a quarter of them were aware that they could register, was very interesting indeed. We've got a major job to actually communicate internationally and get this message out.
And how do you find those people in order to communicate with them?
Well, if I could delve back into my previous life a bit, I was posted in Brazil as ambassador for 4 years. We knew a lot of the Brits in Brazil, and many of them actually had dealings with us at various rates. So we knew a lot. We also had communications channels that we would use and just broadcast things out. So we'd use social media a lot. And in every country, the local embassy, consulate, ambassador will have pretty good communications channels. You'd obviously want to use some local media. And you can, I'd be going on the radio or the TV and saying there's an election coming up, please register to vote, these are your opportunities. We haven't pushed that so much this time, but I think probably we will want to be doing that more as part of the discussion with FCDO.
Thank you, Chair.
I think Mr. Dillon wanted to come in and then Mr. Taylor.
Yeah, just a quick, so you were mentioning the ability to run pilots, but for them to benefit us in our next general election, they'd need to be run prior to that. So are there any intentions with the Scottish elections, for example, to run any pilots there in relation to the schemes that you've outlined?
Overseas voting?
Yeah.
No, I don't think we've got any pilots we've currently got scheduled for this 2026. We're literally now deep in the finalising the conduct orders for the 26 election, so it's already too late. And the timescales here, as the Chair already said, are quite slow. It's already too late, I think, to make any significant changes to the way the elections in May 26 will work.
So do you think these pilots would be for the next general election if it was May, when we anticipate one to be?
Yes, if we can get the pilots done and then whatever legislative changes are needed in time, we would love to have something in place which gives overseas voters a better experience at the 28-29 general than they had at this one.
Sir?
Very briefly, just conscious of time, you mentioned Australia, Canada and New Zealand as electoral systems, processes, organisations that work well. In terms of overseas electors, do you have examples where systems are in place that you look at and say that seems to be quite a sensible way to do it?
The Australian one is a very interesting one. I think I don't think I'm wrong, but the largest Australian polling station in the world is actually the High Commission here in London. And they've run a very impressive operation, which my Australian counterpart and I went to see, and to see how they did it. Clearly other embassies and consulates from other countries do the same. So there is quite a lot of experience as to how people can run this abroad.
Importantly there, your point was that most countries use their consulates and their embassies, which we do not.
Yes, quite a lot of the ones who run our kind of system do use their, but they have some of their underlying systems, like the electoral register, are significantly more advanced. So you can go into an Australian polling station from a different area, and they will print you out the ballot paper for exactly the area that you are registered in. You fill it in, and it will then all be processed. And that's because they have a register which spans all Australian voters, and they know exactly which ballot paper you're entitled to. We could not do that at the moment with the technology and the state of the register that we have. We can't inform, for example, political parties that they've already lobbied someone, or that a voter has died, and don't hassle them or their family. And that's something we hear from political parties. So there's a number of really fundamental underlying system changes that would enable all of these things to be done.
That's helpful, because I think that informs kind of the first question that needs to be fixed before we can do other things better. Thank you.
Right. Okay, that's overseas voting. Let's turn to voter ID and fraud. My speaker list tells me I've got Luke, Michelle, Peter and Chris Curtis.
Thank you. So I'm quite keen on evidence-based policy, and the implementation of voter ID was suggested to be introduced to tackle electoral fraud and particular personation. From the figures that we've seen in various reports, it was suggested that between in 2019, after which the previous government brought in the voter ID rules, there were 34 allegations of personation, which is 0.0000057% of the 58 million votes cast in that election, and then 2 people cautioned or convicted out of 58 million votes, which was 0.00035% of votes. We then saw turnout drop, and from the report as well, suggestion of up to, I think it was 3.1 million. Hold on a second, I'm trying to find. 1.9 million people who said that they, from surveys, didn't vote because of voter ID. Do you think that the voter ID, the impact of voter ID, was a proportionate response to the problem it was trying to solve?
It was intending, I think, to solve a number of issues, and obviously we've had voter ID in Northern Ireland now for about 20 years. I think it's had some effect, and we published a bespoke paper on this in early September, looking at the general election and trying to learn some of the lessons from it. It has, I mean, just to set up what I think we found, a small group of people didn't bring voter ID to the polling station. Most of those went away, got ID, came back and were able to vote, but some didn't vote. So 0.08% didn't vote. About 16,000 people, therefore, at this general election didn't vote or were unable to vote, and they should have been able to. So it's had some effect. And so
Right, they arrived at a polling station and then didn't return. So that was 0.8, you said.
0.08%, 16,000 people.
That literally turned up at the front, turned up and spoke to the polling clerk, because obviously there may have been people that got discouraged before that you're not counting in those numbers.
Absolutely. That's people who actually spoke to them, and they were then turned away and came back. We'll come back to people who were discouraged in just a second. The system which on voter ID was surprisingly underused was the voter authority certificate. We had, I think, 210,000 people applied for a VAC between January 23 and the deadline for the general election. 26,000 VACs were used, 26,000 out of a 40-odd million voters. So it seemed remarkably low. And that was obviously part of the solution, was trying to give people who didn't have other forms of voter ID. That has informed, therefore, and the evidence has therefore informed our recommendations that we should expand the list of acceptable IDs. And we've made those recommendations publicly and to government, particularly, obviously the veterans card is being debated at the moment, but there are a number of others which could be added as well. To target some of the groups who find it harder to engage. So there are various travel discount cards, for example, that would work. And crucially, a digital ID as well, because at the moment producing a piece of paper that someone has to bring, if you could have a digital ID, and we've found some with the right security standards, that would help people tremendously be able to just show their phone at a polling station. Finally, for those who don't have it, we recommend that government, in this case this would be something that would have to come through Parliament, look at vouching or attestation. So if someone knows you very well and they are a registered elector and they say, yes, I know this person and I attest formally that they are this person, which many councils can also do, they ought to be able to vote. All of that is with a view to broadening the accessibility for this. Now, some people are put off by it. And our data we saw, and this was from public opinion research, asking people did they vote or not. This was not just people who did vote. Of those who said they didn't vote, about 4% gave voter ID as one of the reasons. And it's not a complete, it's not an absolute link. They had many reasons for not voting. Voter ID clearly played a factor. 4% of those who didn't vote had that as a factor. So it has put some people off. What we managed to do before the election was run some quite significant communications campaigns and get knowledge of the voter ID requirement right up. Because, to be honest, we were concerned before the election that there would be a real differential between different regions. England having done it, Scotland having not done it. You can imagine some of the political reaction had there been a real difference in the number of voters turned away. That didn't happen. We were broadly at the high 80s to 90% awareness across the whole of the UK, and it was pretty uniform. So that was good. We're going to have to continue this, but what we now see is, having made the change and Parliament having legislated for this change, people are getting used to it. As I say, most did bring some form of voter ID. It might, but our data is not that great, but it might have had some increase in trust in the election that you had to show an ID, and so concerns about personation do exist. You're absolutely right, the numbers are incredibly low, but the concerns about this, any forms of mistrust might have been helped by it. But hopefully this will then become very much like Northern Ireland, where it's taken for granted that you'll bring a form of voter ID for an election.
Just to recap back to the beginning, though, was voter ID and personation a problem that the Electoral Commission saw prior to 2019 when it was put into the manifesto of a political party?
We were very unusual in not having any check on the person turning up to vote, and this was something regularly reported by international observers, and the Electoral Commission for about 20 years is saying, look, we need to do something about this. But our position has been, yes, we do need to do something about it, because it will increase confidence in the electoral process. But one person turned away is too many. People should be able to exercise their vote. And that's why we are now in this position of recommending changes that will deal with those people who were either turned away or put off. I mean, as you've indicated, the numbers who were actually turned away at the polling stations is the tip of an iceberg of people who felt that voter ID was a deterrent to them. So we must increase our public awareness, but we must also look at how we can make changes to the voter authority certificate, to the list of forms of ID that would be acceptable, particularly for those that were put off. So the job seekers allowance card, which would be another thing that would directly go to groups of unemployed people who we know were put off more than others. And the over 18s Oyster card will be another one where we know young people, there were lots of concerns.
I don't want to drill too much into the detail of what could or could not be permitted. What I did just want to ask you very quickly before I bring in Michelle Welsh is on the data of people who are turned away.
Yes.
Our presumption is that those are people who were qualified to vote and on the register but didn't have ID. Not just people who turned up but who weren't on the register and were turned away. That's correct, yes? Yes. Fine. Thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, thank you. You've just talked about the voter authority certificate and expanding the list of accepted IDs and introducing vouching as a way of improving the voter ID system. You've touched on, in practice, what impact you think these measures would have, and I would like to, hear some more with regards to that. But in addition to that, I'd be really interested to know what work has been done or is intended to be done with regards to where these people were with regards to that they didn't have voter ID. Was it a particular socio-economic group? Where was the voter ID actually a hindrance and a barrier to people voting? Now, I say this as someone that is a Member of Parliament in North Nottinghamshire, when it was very, very clear where that barrier was and who those people were that weren't voting. It was very, very clear. And it is probably very different in different areas. So I'd be very interested, as a barrier to voting, who was that a barrier to? Because at the moment we're talking about this on a whole big scale of, well, if we have this ID and we have that, what work has been done to identify actually who are those people that need that ID? Where is that missing gap in our system? Because the people that were coming and approaching me when I was out, I'm not voting, it's the first time I've never voted because I don't have any ID. And I haven't voted, and then we discussed it. So I know what my own personal perhaps perspective might be on it, but it'd be interesting to know what work you have done with regards to that.
Well, I mean, when the policy was first introduced in 2023 in the local elections, the group that seemed to be most cut off from voting were disabled voters. And so Vijay's quoted a figure of 4% for the population as a whole. It was about 9% for disabled voters who felt that voter ID was a barrier to them. And it wasn't necessarily because they didn't have ID, they just hadn't understood what needed to be done and hadn't got the support necessary to ensure that they were producing ID. And I mean, I observed this myself in polling stations. And that was better by the general election. So that was an example where once we can identify the specific barriers and people who are concerned, we can work with civil society organisations and directly with voters and with returning officers to try and address the question. For the general election, the groups that really did stand out, I think, were unemployed people particularly, and people in more manual occupations. So again, I've mentioned that the Job Centre Plus card, I think for them some of those were because they didn't have a form of ID, they didn't have a passport or a driving licence for all kinds of reasons, or some of the other ones on the list. So expanding the list should make it much more accessible for those kind of people. So in our report we've got a kind of series of lists, but those were the two groups. So for 2023, as I said, it was the disabled voters, and it was the unemployed and people in more manual occupations that were particularly affected, and we can see potential solutions for them. But there are other smaller groups. I mean, homeless people, I think, are often less likely to have ID, and how we work with their communities. Vijay's already mentioned gypsy and traveller communities. Trans communities are ones where visual identity may be difficult if people look very different now to they did on any form of ID that they have got. So some of these are really quite precise. So I think our links with our survey work and our links with civil society organisations are giving us quite a good insight, to quite a granular level as to who we need to work with. And our recommendations are designed to increase the list, so we go directly to people who will have some forms of ID but not the ones currently on the list, to create in the voter authority certificate an alternative to those, and particularly if a digital solution can be found. And then finally the vouching option, which we've seen to work in Canada, where someone who is already on the register can say, right, this person who's with me is who they say they are, and therefore is eligible to vote. So has that got to the question, or do you want to drill down a bit deeper?
Yeah, and that actually confirms what I thought, but are there parts of the country or constituencies where this was more prevalent? So is there more work to do, for example, in a certain council area than others? Have we got down to that level with regards to it? Does it affect the north of England, for example, more than it affects the south of England, would be my question. Does it affect mining communities more than it does in a city? Where does it affect people the most at the moment would be my next question. Have we got to that level?
Like I said, yes, we did. We did get down to that level of detail. We've published the data on this. We don't see a strong geographical or urban-rural distinction on this. We did see, but by far the strongest distinction was on social grade. So C2DE gave us very different answers from other social grades, particularly about not voter ID being actually putting them off voting. So they give a stronger response. The other ones, as John has said, unemployed, disabled people, and those renting from a social landlord was the second part, where there's a statistically different reaction to voter ID. So our proposals to expand the list are trying to pick up the forms of ID which those people are likely to have. Most people have some form of ID which is sufficient to prove their identity, and it depends a little bit on the sort of security tolerance which Parliament chooses. But none of the other differences were statistically significant.
Sorry, my last question, sorry. Did it have more of an impact on women or men?
We couldn't see a strong gender difference either. We've published the kind of the breakdown tables of this. I'm very happy to go into that in more detail. I say those 4 groups that we put in our report were the ones where there was a clear statistical difference, and the strongest of that was social class.
There were some differences by ethnicity that are also a potential factor here, and again working with different communities so that there is a real understanding and appreciation of how it will work in practice.
Thank you. Forgive me, I've got Peter who wanted to come in this, and then...
I don't believe my point is relevant anymore, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That's useful for time management. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, a lot of the discussion we've had today has sort of come back to you as an organisation being able to provide data, recommend changes that the government is therefore responsible for enacting. And that is the process that we've gone through with voter ID. And I think what makes many of us quite uncomfortable with that process is the way we saw it play out with voter ID, where for some of the reasons that were brought up so far, I am not convinced at all that your recommendation to change to voter ID in any way balanced the risk management when you made that strong recommendation in 2014. So I suppose my first question would be, how can you reassure me, given the data that we've heard so far, that you did correctly balance the risks against the very, very small number of people who were enacting impersonification in order to come to that conclusion?
We've tried to give as much of an accurate perspective in this report as we can do of where we are. And I think the position we're in is better than many feared it would be, but not as good as it needs to be if we're going to achieve the balance that you've described. And we said at the outset, and were very clear publicly and in our conversations with the government, that if the voter ID legislation was going to be successful, and what we needed to maintain a healthy democracy, it needed to meet the security requirements, which were the dominant thing in the minds of the government when it proposed this in the first place. They need to meet those concerns, but not at the cost of accessibility. And our evidence base there was the evidence base from Northern Ireland that we'd seen within quite a quick period. People had become used to doing this, and it had been attuned to the way in which people were able to respond to the policy. And we have not seen for many years now any issue at all with voter ID in Northern Ireland. And we expect with the changes that we have made that the same will be true in the rest of the UK as well. But the final criterion was workability for local authorities, which we haven't talked about. And there was a real concern that we had that this would be extremely difficult to administer, likely to result in long queues at polling stations because it would be very slow getting through. And the responses we've had back from local authorities and our own observation is that did not happen. And I think local authorities did a magnificent job of training their staff, of organising systems, and it was certainly very slick everywhere I went. And so the remaining block is to get us up to the kind of situation we've got in Northern Ireland in terms of accessibility.
I think with respect, that wasn't quite the question. I mean, I do appreciate that there were some bad things that some people said were going to happen, or we feared might happen that didn't happen. I think what worries many people, or certainly worries me, is that there was a recommendation made by the Electoral Commission in order to bring this in 2014, because, well, there seemed to be two arguments. Firstly, because of to stop personification, which, as we've heard, data didn't exist pretty much, at least compared to the many other forms of electoral fraud, of which were significantly higher. So I can't see why that justified the risk, the damage it has done to people's ability to vote in the country. The other one was perception of risk, which also doesn't seem to stand up based on the data. If you look at the polling data back at the time, there was very high level of trust and satisfaction in our democracy. And when you ask people what the biggest problems they thought were with our democracy, the idea of personification was incredibly far down people's priority lists. So there doesn't seem to me to be a justification to make that recommendation based on actual risk. There doesn't seem to be justification based on perceived risk from the polling data that we had at the time. So it just seems very strange to me that you as an organisation recommended that change, given those two facts.
The recommendation came from our observation of what is happening in other countries, our own observation of people are expected to provide some form of verification of who they are in so many other settings.
Can I just cut in there?
Mr. Taylor, let Mr. Pullinger finish.
In so many other settings, and I think many people are surprised we didn't have it. And certainly in the conversations I had in 2023, when we first introduced it, talking to many polling station staff, they were surprised themselves. They said, well, this is a risk that it may not have materialised much yet, but it could do, and let's close the door before the horse bolts. But we were always clear we should not introduce this unless we met these other tests too. And I think I feel some regret that the way it was introduced, in a sense, created it as more of a divisive policy than it might have needed to be. And I think there was an urgency in the way the government wanted this in by 2024, and Mr. Hall was in another role at the time, and we had many discussions about it, and the need to do this in a way that generates public acceptability in advance was something which I think we could have done better on with hindsight. So I remain content with our recommendation, but I think if we had been starting again now, a more careful approach to making sure we really had taken into consideration the challenges Ms. Welch's interventions indicate for certain communities, and the risks we knew were likely to materialise. We could have dealt with up front some of the things that have now been dealt with in Northern Ireland, but are still to be dealt with in the rest of the UK.
Just two little questions to finish on. I'm still not completely convinced on those arguments either. I'm not convinced. You don't say we're going to make a change because other people are doing it in order to solve a problem that doesn't exist. That doesn't feel like a particularly compelling argument either. And neither does, well, it works in Northern Ireland eventually, because 4 or 5 election cycles, people will get used to it. You're still disenfranchising many people in the election cycles in the meantime. I'm just completely not convinced by this argument at all, that the recommendation was justified. But just two very quick separate questions. Fantastic statistician, John. A lot of data is missing, and evidence base is missing for this decision as well, I think would acknowledge. We don't actually have good data on how many people do not have acceptable forms of ID and all questions like that. So I suppose, what kind of data and evidence do you think that we should be able to be starting to collect in order to do this? Related to that, a lot of the data and evidence that has been collected has been through online polling. I say this as a background in polling, particularly online. Do you think that's appropriate way to collect this data, given that most people who are not registered to vote, most people who are unlikely to be have ID are also unlikely to be signed up to online panels? And I think the final question I'd have, if it's all right, is before this scheme was introduced widespread in local elections in 2023, there were 2 pilots in 2 very specific local areas that actually tested this out beforehand, which did not gather evidence, as Michelle was saying, about how it might affect different communities accurately, about how it might implement differently across different places. So do you think that implementation process should have been, in hindsight, far wider piloted than it was before it was introduced?
To the last question, yes, I think with hindsight it should have been, because you need to get down to the granular detail. On the broader point, I mean, you know my background, I think we need far better data across the whole system to be able to have a really clear understanding of how well it is working. And it's something that Vijay and I had a lot of conversations about, and I mean, he's already mentioned some of it in relation to some of our earlier responses. I think the key to getting there is probably through the registration system, and getting much better information about who is registered, so that we can look at, in a much more granular way, the gaps, and so who's not registered, what is happening to those who are, because you're right, I mean, online polling is becoming a much less reliable way of getting, well, even the evidence you used to get in the past, and that evidence was generally about just getting broad averages about what's going on, rather than helping you to look at the patterns of behaviour under the bonnet. And I think we need to be much more sophisticated in the way we're thinking about information and gathering data and reporting it and making it available to you, particularly at constituency levels, which obviously matters to you, but also looking at different local authorities, how they're performing, what's happening in different wards, what's happening within different communities. We mentioned private rented communities and social housing areas as well, to really see what is happening in places like this to people like me, so that we can be helped and supported in our ability to exercise our vote. So I think it's a very significant piece of work, which is part of our corporate plan that Vijay's already mentioned, that we will be trying to raise our game, working with others, including the government, on getting that data, so that we and you can hold the whole system much more effectively to account.
Vijay.
Luke, do you want to come back briefly?
Yeah, just very briefly, you talked about broader international systems and comparisons with the voter ID systems, and there being many countries where voter ID is a thing and it's accepted. Was a comparison made with those countries where a nationally available, whether it's compulsory or optional, general ID card is available? Because you look at New Zealand, which does not. It is in all of our examples of good electoral systems, they do not have a national ID card, they do not have voter ID. We are a very different country culturally to a lot of countries where, particularly in Europe, you have ID cards. Was that taken into account when we looked at other countries and said, oh, well, we'll get used to it?
Well, yes, but it's undoubtedly a lot easier where you have got a national ID card that everybody is required to hold.
That seems self-evident. It does not seem to have been taken into that much account when actually implementing this incredibly dramatic policy.
I think there was a significant amount of work done primarily within government to look at who holds which sorts of ID. And we are thinking now there's about 3% of people who don't hold one of the IDs that's currently on that list. But certainly that work was done. The government led the work, but with us and others to really make an assessment of where the gaps are. And that's what created the idea of the voter authority certificate, because there were substantial numbers of people who did not have one of the accepted forms of ID, so something needed to be done to enable them to get something specifically for this purpose. So the intention there, I think, was right. The implementation hasn't been very good. As Vijay described, the voter authority certificate was only used in 26,000, which is a tiny number of cases, given the number of people we think do not hold one of those forms of ID. So let's reform that, and let's increase the list of accepted ID, and that will narrow the gap. But from your comments and Mr. Curtis's comments, I mean, you are looking, as we are, for a very substantial improvement, because one person turned away is one too many, and I think we would all hold to that.
I finished my question just by asking whether the fundamental principle of voter ID is being evaluated. If it is a system that cannot work without other changes, a national ID card, which obviously is not on the agenda, is the principle of it being evaluated, as well as how to make a bad system work, in my opinion.
Well, approach that we have taken is in the report, which we think the right approach now, having implemented it, is to make it work better.
Now, I'm conscious of time, and there are two statements which colleagues may want to take part in after health questions. I'm happy to go on. I'm tempted, however, we did want to cover just electoral administration, which we've sort of slightly dipped in and dipped out of en passant during earlier questions and answers. If colleagues are happy, I propose that we just effectively table in written form those questions to the Commission and receive a written submission on them. We are going to hear from the Association of Electoral Administrators in due course anyway, so they will be able to certainly put flesh on the bones. But if everybody's sort of happy with that approach? Bottoms have got numb enough as it is. Time to move on. Can I thank you, Mr. Pullinger, and your colleagues for attending this morning. A lively issue, as we all know. I'm tempted to say because we were all elected, the system all worked terribly well. But that I appreciate would just be too superficial an assessment of where we are. But we're really grateful to you for your time, and also, I just say this in closing, for the work that the Commission does in general in helping play a very important role in maintaining the integrity of our electoral system, which, as we know, through all sorts of pressures, comes under an awful lot of intense scrutiny from time to time. So thank you very much indeed. Order.